Hello everyone and welcome to Talking Frames, Dialogues in Management Education and Film. We're delighted to open this space for reflection and exchange, where the languages of management and cinema meet as ways of seeing, questioning and learning about the world we inhabit. This workshop marks the first public step of a broader project supported by the University of Leicester Teaching Development Fund. Its aim is to explore how film can transform management education, helping students engage not only with concepts, but with emotions, ethics, and the complexities of human organization. Leading today's conversation are Dr. Paolo Vargio, Associate Professor at the Leicester Law School at the University of Leicester and Chair of this session, Dr. Matteo Cicognani, Lecturer at the Business School of the University of Leicester and researcher whose work bridges film and management studies, and Arianna Careddu, PhD candidate at the University of Cagliari, focusing on inclusive language and visual communication. Together, they've been developing an innovative and inclusive approach to teaching management through film, one that values diversity of perspectives, critical dialogue, and the visual imagination. Thank you for joining us. Let's begin the conversation.
Thank you for letting me present my experience this afternoon. My name is David Buchanan, Professor of Organisational Behaviour at Cranfield University. My interest within that field is change management and organisation politics. I've been using film and TV programmes for many years, conscious of the fact that this topic has a history of about a quarter of a century or more. I first started using film and television in teaching back in the 1990s, and some of you may be familiar with the work of an American author called Joseph Champoux, who around that time wrote a number of books identifying movie clips illustrating organisational behaviour and human resource management concepts. I mention Champoux because I try not to use film or television just to illustrate. I think we can do better than that. I think we can use it as material to suggest more critical engagement with the material. The reason why I think this began in the 1990s is that before then, the only place you could watch a movie was at the cinema. But of course, with the advent of DVDs, and more recently streaming, everyone has access to movies. So either you can use this in the classroom, or you can send your class home to do that. It's much more possible now. So my aim this afternoon is to share 4 examples of the ways in which I've used film and TV in my teaching. The first example, one of my favourites, is the movie The Devil Wears Prada, which some of you may be familiar with. I only use the first 7 minutes of the movie, where Anne Hathaway comes out of the lift, goes to the interview and eventually leaves. Just those 7 minutes. Now what I do before I show this is to ask the group that I'm working with to concentrate on 4 issues. First, how would you describe Miranda Priestley's leadership style? Miranda's played by Meryl Streep. We're led to believe that her character is based on the editor-in-chief of Vogue fashion magazine. How would you describe her style? Second, what impact does she have on her employees? Third, is she a good boss or a bad boss? And finally, why do you think Miranda Priestley gave Andrea Sachs a job? I went into that in some detail, and this may be stating the obvious, but I think you have to move your audience from being passive viewers who are just there to be entertained to explanation and the development of insights. I think that the briefing you give in advance is critical. You're not just sitting a group down saying, watch this and tell me what you see. I think you have to offer some specific direction. So when I ask, what is Miranda's leadership style? Be specific. What impact does she have on her employees? Be specific. I think the briefing here is critical. The briefing I'll give for this may actually take longer than the 7 minutes of the clip itself, just to make sure everybody's focused on the issues at hand. But the other obvious thing to say is about the debriefing. I won't just trigger a discussion of the clip. I think it's important to debrief with one or more takeaways. What's the payoff? Why did we watch this? The kind of session structure that I normally use is very simple, very standard. Briefing, viewing, group discussion, feedback, debriefing. What I find is that the timing of these sessions can be extraordinarily difficult to estimate. That 7-minute clip can actually drive a full 1-hour session, a 1-hour tutorial, depending on how you want to develop the discussion, but also depending on how the group decides to develop the discussion. But the 7-minute clip doesn't just take 10 minutes to discuss. This could be a long, detailed, critical discussion or conversation. That's one example of the way in which I've used short film clips. This is a completely different approach altogether. I have on a number of occasions used an entire movie, such as the movie Elizabeth from 1998. This lasts for 2 hours. The discussion of this, the viewing of it and the discussion of it can take 2 to 3 hours. It's actually taken me 3.5 to 4 hours one time. I usually stop it every 15 minutes or so for discussion. We then log that discussion on flip charts and start again for another 15 minutes and stop it again, and so on. It's a judgment call where you start and when you stop, but this can drive the whole half-day discussion. I'm not going to read through the briefing here because it's rather lengthy and detailed, but it's to make the point, because it's a 2-hour movie. It takes a bit of time. You have to set the scene for the audience, set the scene for your group. The movie itself is a study of transformational change in 2 dimensions. One dimension is Elizabeth transforms the English economic and cultural environment, but she also transforms herself. It's a personal transformation journey as well as a corporate transformation journey. In the briefing, I direct the group to concentrate on 6 issues: context, young Elizabeth, mature Elizabeth, advisors, politics, and lessons. What I typically do is, if I have whiteboards or flip charts, then I'll put these headings up on the wall around the room. If it's a large group, then I can set that up in a cabaret style with 6 groups. Each group will get a chart or heading to log the answers to. If it's a small group, I'll do this myself. So the logistics can vary. Each time I stop the movie, I'll ask them about each of the 6 headings as appropriate. By the end of the movie, we'll get a picture of the context, how Elizabeth has matured with experience, the people and the politics she's had to deal with, and leadership lessons. Discussion of these issues, again, can be open-ended. If you have a whole day available to you, then this could well work, because one might then want to translate those observations and lessons to the wider world of leadership in contemporary businesses. This is another example where I used just a 6-minute clip from a Danish television series called Borgen. Some of you may have seen this. It was available on Channel 4, and it's about a female states minister in Denmark, right about the time when Denmark did have a female states minister. And it's about the politics that she has to deal with. I'm very well aware that this doesn't sound like a very promising introduction to a TV series, but it's gripping and well worth watching. Basically, it's about the internal politics of the Danish government. At one point, in order to pass a finance bill, she has to persuade one of her new right-wing opponents, Yvonne Kjær, to support the bill. Yvonne doesn't want to do that because she's been told by one of her own colleagues to keep in line and vote against it. Birgitte Nyborg, the state minister, lives in Marienborg, which is a beautiful, stately residence on the outskirts of Copenhagen. The question for the group watching this is, how does Birgitte win the support of Yvonne Kjær? What tactics does she use that can work for you in your role? So this is about political tactics. These are the tactics that she uses. She has honest advisors, trusted advisors. That's a contrast from the Elizabeth movie, by the way. She meets other players individually. She gives Yvonne tea and biscuits at Marienborg. She uses her resources, her position, her power, her confidence, her body language. And most controversially, it's possible that she lies. She tells Yvonne that her boss, Laugesen, tells her what to do. Did he really? We don't know if that's true or not. She also offers a bribe, using funds that she was going to give to someone else. She's now free from that commitment, and she can use the money to bribe Yvonne. The point is, Yvonne decides to support the bill, then it goes through. So that potentially opens up a discussion not only of organisation politics, but of the kinds of potentially dirty tricks that politicians may or may not use in order to achieve their ends. This is my last example, and it comes from a TV series called The Walking Dead, which again some of you may be familiar with if you haven't actually seen it. And used this on a couple of occasions. And on one occasion, a colleague used this, a co-author used this with a group of policemen in Sweden from an incident control centre group of cops in northern Sweden. Well, the section clip that we use in this case, again, we're back to a 7-minute clip, very short. And it's where Rick, who is one of the leading characters in the film, in the TV series, who's staying at a farm with his friend Herschel. And they go into town, which of course is abandoned because there are zombies everywhere. And they meet up with 2 other guys, Dave and Tony, who are a bit suspect, and they want to come back to the farm. But as far as Rick's concerned, he doesn't know these guys, and the farm's quite busy already. There isn't really space for another two people, especially people we don't know, and they're a bit dodgy. So what we do here is we'll play the clip, play the 7 minutes, but pause it at one point when Rick says, "I hear Nebraska's nice," because the clip continues after that. But when watching the clip, the questions are, well, how should Rick handle this? Rick's an ex-sheriff in the States. And the broader question from this is, what does the ideal person spec for leaders in a crisis situation of this kind? Rather than leave this open-ended, what they usually do is give the group these 4 options. What should Rick do? Remind Dave and Tony he's a sheriff and tell them to leave. Keep them talking, find out more about their group. Shoot Dave and Tony if they make any hostile moves, or let Dave and Tony bring their group to the farm. Extra hands are always useful. What actually happens when you start the clip again after "I hear Nebraska's nice," Dave reaches for his gun, Rick shoots him, he then shoots Tony as he levels his shotgun. They shoot both of them, okay? So once again, one of the questions asked in the briefing was, what's the ideal person spec for a leader in this kind of situation? And that potentially opens quite a critical discussion of the extent to which a leader might resort to, in this case, violence, any kind of violence, never mind the extreme violence that occurs in this case. This is my summary. Why use movies? I think movies can be read as organizational and ethnographic case studies. One of the most famous, of course, is The Wire, which has seen a number of publications based on it. Movies do bring abstract concepts to life. Narratives, stories in general, are implicit process theories because they unfold and then, and then, and then. So process theories explain how events unfold over time and context. Movies can also be seen as role plays or simulations. What psychologists do is put people in a lab, give them a problem, observe how they behave. What screenwriters, novelists, playwrights do is put people in a real context, give them a problem, see how they behave. Movies graphically show the nature, role, and consequences of emotion, difficult to capture any other way. Movies also give us access to contexts, extreme contexts, disaster settings, catastrophe contexts that are not only difficult to observe, but also to research. And movies also deal with controversial ethical dilemmas. There's the couple that I've mentioned already in the last 2 examples in particular, and to some extent in the movie Elizabeth. So I think there are a number of advantages, there may be more, not benefits, in using movies in organizational behavior and human resource management teaching. We're dealing here with fiction as if it was something completely divorced from reality. But of course, fiction writers are concerned with plausibility. They're concerned with reality. They're concerned with representing human behavior more or less accurately. So the dividing line between fiction and non-fiction, I think, is blurred. And a number of commentators have made that observation. That's it.
Thank you so much, David. That was really insightful. And I have a few questions myself, especially as a Walking Dead scholar, but I'll save them for a bit later. So now I will move straight to the second presentation of the day. So Matteo, over to you.
Reimagining management education, a multimodal pedagogical approach to film and linguistic inclusivity is the title of the project that Arianna and I have initiated here within the cadre of the College of Business Teaching Development Fund for 2025. And it is a project that finds its kind of foundations within a series of experiments that I started in the context of different modules, like my module on management theory, where I devised a diptych of lectures entitled diptych in the sense that they were complementary to one another. The module is about the various ways through which management intersect various sociological themes. And I thought it was interesting to talk about corporate cinema and the evolution of brand communication, and also how cinema and filmmaking basically set the foundation of contemporary brand communication through all the other medias, including the Internet of Things. And the other lecture is basically the complementary one. It explores how management and organization are expounded in films and popular culture. Contextually, I've also stated this kind of seminar based on this reading that explore the critical perspective of toxic and bad leadership through films. And I basically decided to explore good, bad, toxic, and more ambiguous forms of leadership following the reading, allowing the students to get prepared, watching some excerpts of films like The Dark Knight by Christopher Nolan and The Joker by Todd Phillips, 2019. And I think it was quite an interesting experiment per se. But then I was asked to be part of a carousel of lectures within the cadre of managing human resources as a module. And I decided to provide a screening of The Five Obstructions, which is a film by Jürgen Leth and Lars von Trier. It's the first documentary approach undertaken by Lars von Trier. This film is provenance in an earlier short film by Jürgen Leth, The Perfect Human, a kind of very minimalistic black and white film in 1967, which shows a very suited-up man and a woman that basically pose questions, kind of mimic the questions posed by the voiceover. And Trier admires this short film so much that he wanted to attempt a remake. So together with Leth, Trier takes on the task of challenging conventional ways of documentary film and production. So Trier's idea is to authoritatively challenge Leth to devise 5 remakes of this film. Still, Trier will put forward obstructions each time, constraining Leth to rethink the original film story and characters through some organizational, technical, and linguistic obstructions, constraints. So in an atmosphere of role-playing and co-perform production, Leth will have to deal with his colleagues' limitations, commands, and prohibitions. In the final output, we see together the spaces in which the behind-the-scenes took place, Leth's execution of the obstructions commanded by Trier, and the final cut of the actual remakes. Students engage through emotion and aesthetics after the screening of 40 minutes of this film. So a little bit in between what you've done, David. Many students responded viscerally to the film. Some found it beautiful, others strange, but overall they were kind of moved about that. One student said it was a mixed bed of water flip, but continued reflecting on risk and aesthetics, for instance. He said he took like that big risk. He just thought it was stupid editing at the end of the day, but he conceded that Jürgen Leth's solutions to Lars von Trier constraints were kind of challenging and courageous. Even when confused, other students reported an emotional connection, feeling something but not understanding it until later, which is something that mimics one of the main concepts expressed in the Matrix film, The Perfect Human. So some students were kind of parroting what they listen in the film, and contextually these were also very meaningful expressions. It also stimulated deep reflection and metaphors for leadership. Students that were parallel in the film to autocratic leadership, control, freedom, and power dynamics. So the idea that freedom was felt like a punishment after Lars von Trier saw the second obstruction, he thought that Jürgen Leth didn't quite follow his injunction. So he said, now you can have a completely free remake. And this kind of freedom was felt like a punishment. And this aspect provoked discussion on the relationship with authority in class. Other encouraged comparison with other films and real-life experiences. A student related with The Office, which I reinforce saying that the film is indisputably a goldmine of management issues. Others talked about their parallel experiences within teaching and education in other countries, like in Russia or in Czech Republic, comparing different A levels and national education system. I'm very much interested in the way they were abstracting from the film and using it as a springboard to talk about their own educational, different education systems. So bridging personal histories, but also cross-cultural sensitivity and ethical awareness. So there is a scene in Bombay that sparked a powerful ethical discussion, especially from students with direct cultural ties. There is a scene where Jorgen Lett is wearing a suit-up dress, a tuxedo, and he's basically having this kind of luxurious meal behind the red district of Bombay. Another student raised concerns about the ethics of filming and consumption in poverty-stricken areas. But in general, there was a space for creative interpretation and rethinking management because this kind of film enables students to reflect on what the perfect human means in leadership and organizational life. What does it mean to be perfect in this climate of high performativity? And this symbolic shift from mentor to mentee, which is depicted in the film, offers a metaphor for vulnerability in leadership as well, which is an interesting point. So why analyze management or HRM through films? To start with, because Lars von Trier and Jorgen Lett are provocative film directors that create a shock to thoughts associated, as most of you know, with Document 1995 movement, which it is a movement that challenges conventional cinema. But what is more important is that it is a meta film that subverts the normal canons of representation. And it provokes the taken for granted reception of filmmaking practice and organizational praxis. So the creative energy of management research through film, as Marty Woods pointed out, is something that promotes effective engagement, the emotional response, the immersive experience. Films make us feel the argument around management and HRM, and they're often more powerful than conventional practices. As I said already, as I anticipated, and apologies for that, it is a meta film. It is a meta-cinematic experiment that conveys organizing, coordinating, and managing aspects that focuses on the commissioner-artist relationship, the manager-subordinate relationship as well. So just to wrap up, and then I'll pass the word to Arianna. Some critical reflections that came out on top of what we said is that the limitations can spur creativity. That's what the film, this is a kind of point the film tries to make. And the parallelism that we can create with HRM is that the film resembles a professional development discussion meeting, or it can trigger insights on strategies of communication, training, and task assignments. It offers insight into how the coordination of human resources and production occurs on the film set. And it covers themes such as leadership, ethical responsibility, role play, as you said, David, co-performed production, self-management, and disorganization. I use, and Martin remembers this very well, that I use this film also to make the point that professionals can watch how filmmaking practice observes its own workplace logistics and funnel these insights back to their own organizational realms, which is something that some students came back to me with, but it's not all gold where it glitters. And that's exactly what Arianna told me in her analysis, observing my teaching and the results of the teaching. So I will pass the ball to her.
Okay, so we know that we live in a world saturated with images, and it becomes evident how essential it is not to only read images critically, but also to design and deploy them in ways that enhance accessibility and understanding across diverse audiences. As Matteo explained, students in this project were asked to watch a film and discuss it. While the idea is promising, we believe the way it was implemented was not the most effective. Educators, first of all, I think must consider who the students are. And here we have mainly 18 to 30-year-olds who relies on smartphone for daily activities like paying bill, finding information, etc. And they are culturally fluent in mainstream cinema and familiar with influencers and science communicators in their social and linguistic circles. And this shared background shapes in visual communication like memes, stickers, and GIFs, and are the shorthand for expressing ideas socially constructive from collective experiences. The objective is to help students move from passive spectator to active interpreters, as already David said. And it is valuable to expose them to visual material they usually consume uncritically and support them in recognizing, interpreting, and using it reflectively. It is especially important to examine how relationship between employees, employers, and organizational hierarchies are portrayed in films and TV series. These representations are intentional and distilled to make power relations and emotion clear in just a few frames. So as many scholars have already shown, film is never neutral. Analyzing it helps students grasp abstract concepts like leadership, conflict, and organizational culture. As we said, over the 3 sessions, 34 students provided individual feedback. Their responses can be broadly classified in 2 categories. The first one is what we call not useful, comments that are based primarily on personal taste, confusion, or very superficial impressions. More than half of these responses, almost 56% fell into this category. The negative referred to a lack of understanding, rejection of the format, or discomfort with the content. So a smaller number were positive, but still they were focused mainly on aesthetic appreciation without any clear link to leadership or organizational dynamics. So what does this tell us? It suggests that a significant portion of students struggles to connect the film to the session's core themes, maybe for unfamiliarity with no mainstream visual language, or simply the need for clearer scaffolding and guidance. Tools like interpretive grids or guiding questions could help bridge that gap. The second category includes, obviously, the useful responses, which made up to 44%. 12 were positive and 3 were negative, but still demonstrated thoughtful analysis and relevance of to our learning objectives. This comment showed an ability to engage critically with the film dynamics, touching on issues such as authority, creative constraints, and negotiation in leadership contexts. Interesting, some of the most valuable insights come from students who were critical on the film itself, but used that perspective to explore ethical and cultural questions, for example, the representation of the poverty in Bombay. When well articulated, critical responses can be just as valuable for classroom discussion. So they broaden the conversation to include topics like justice, intercultural sensitivity, and the social responsibilities of leadership, moving beyond pure formal analysis. What we observe in this experiment is that students often focus on the wrong aspect of the film. Instead of engaging with the rational and organizational dynamics, many reacted with confusion, discomfort, or disengagement. And some of most common reactions involve feelings of alienation and frustration. When confusion is not properly mediated, it can quickly become a barrier to engage, so shutting down interpretation before it even begins. And for doing this, we identified 3 main challenges: resistance to complexity, language barriers, and binary responses. While our intention as educator is to challenge students and push them beyond their comfort zone, we must also ensure they are prepared to respond meaningfully. Without preparation, frustration and resistance quickly replace curiosity and the insight. And this orientation can be productive only when it's well supported. So simply exposing students to difficult film without concept rarely leads to reflective engagement. In this situation, students often fall back in binary responses like yes or no, like or dislike, without explaining why. So they need tools to articulate their thoughts, build connection, and reflect critically on leadership or negotiation. This reveals a fundamental misalignment in expectation. Many students approached the film as if they are to interpret the artistic intention of the director. And this is appropriate in film studies, but obviously not in business. And we want to be clear that we are not asking them to become film critics, obviously. We want them to read through the film, to observe interaction, leadership, negotiation, and power dynamics. So the key question is not obviously what does the filmmaker means, but what do the scenes reveal about leadership? Are this pattern effective or problematic? And I relate it with this to what I've studied. So during the screening, students should consider whether the behavior are effective, ethically sound, and applicable to real situations. So we must prepare students by framing the experience and clarifying the analytical lens. Otherwise, they risk missing the point altogether. So to summarize, I like to highlight 5 core takeaways. The first one is we can use images as a thinking tool to identify visual patterns rather than simply summarizing a plot. Second, we must encourage uncertainty. Confusion is not the end point, but the beginning of an inquiry. Third, we should avoid binary responses and instead cultivate a layered dialogue. Fourth, we must leverage multimodality to lower barriers and deepen understanding. And finally, we need to make the pedagogical framework explicit, helping students connect from content and image to idea. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Arianna. That was a very good way to round off the presentations. And whilst we open the Q&A, I'd like to share now with you a sneak peek of the live graphic commentary from Marco, who's been doing amazing stuff in the background. I had the privilege to see that. So I will now open the floor for questions and comments. But I remember Matteo might have a question for Dave. Yeah, Matteo, go ahead.
Thanks a lot, David and Arianna, for these very insightful presentations. I mean, I would like to start probably with David, because we already, and possibly get some other external questions for our tandem project, Arianna. David, the first, thanks a lot for your presentation. The first and most obvious question would be, what kind of film between the comedy, because you mentioned The Devil Wears Prada, an historical drama like Elizabeth, or a political drama like Borgen, or a apocalyptic film like The Walking Dead series, like The Walking Dead, is the best genre to elicit responses connected to management and leadership? And the second answer, if I may, is more related to your very interesting conceptualization of extreme fiction as a form of fiction that kind of takes students in a very uncomfortable position, to assess what would be their behavior in certain extreme circumstances, which is something that is very much we're very much accustomed to it after the pandemic, the cost of living crisis, kind of systemic destruction that our economic system and our society, global society, triggers into our subjectivities.
Thanks, Matteo. The programs that I've chosen, the clips, the TV series, I've chosen because they fit the purpose of whatever I was teaching today. So, for example, we haven't mentioned sci-fi. There's a movie called Contact with Jodie Foster, which is a brilliant way of introducing aspects of organization politics, because she has the expert power, but she comes up against someone who has political skills that she doesn't have, and he just pushes her aside in a very calm, probably ethical, gentlemanly, non-obvious way. She gets dealt back into the game again by a secret backer, and she gets pushed out of the game once again in a very so Contact is a sci-fi movie, and that just happens in the first half of the movie to demonstrate some of the political issues that I wanted to demonstrate. There's another comedy called Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, an old movie. I don't know if you've seen it. And in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, Michael Caine and Steve Martin are on a train heading down to the south of France to con rich women out of their money and jewellery. And he persuades a woman on a train to buy him a meal. How does he do it? It's an exercise in impression management. It's her idea. But she buys him a meal, but he's talked her into doing that. So I don't think there's a genre issue here. I think it just depends on the narrative and the way the narrative is unfolding. As for the zombie movies, or rather the zombie TV series, I think it's important to recognise that the zombie apocalypse materials are not actually about zombies, they're about us. And The Walking Dead in particular it's almost an experiment. I think somebody described it, an experiment in leadership, because you see different styles of leadership arising and being pushed aside throughout the series. It's very rich in terms of explorations of different leadership styles, leadership configurations. So no, I don't think it's a genre issue. I think it depends on the narrative, and you might find that narrative suiting your purpose, excuse me, regardless of the genre. Second question was about extreme fiction, which I think can also be used as a research tool because it allows you access to situations which, as a researcher, you can't get to in person, certainly safely. And I think one of the considerations that we might want to discuss this afternoon in terms of choosing fictional accounts in movies is plausibility. Can I suggest that implausibility can also be a useful criterion if it forces the viewer to think differently, to go beyond, to challenge assumptions. So I'm not convinced that in choosing a movie for pedagogical purposes, we should always go for plausibility. I think implausibility might often be a valuable criterion.
Thanks a lot, David. It does. I'm very much in line with what you're saying when I decided to pick up the 5 obstructions.
Thank you both. I see the chat is becoming lively, so we'll pass the floor to Elisabetta now.
Thank you. Thank you for both very interesting talks. They are really inspiring. I mean, I think I'm going to use some of your examples and suggestions, especially from David, but also from the other source. And for David, I was wondering if the movies proposed in this way as an example for discussion and kind of identification with real context about experience in working, in leading, in crisis, management of crisis, etc., can be considered like conceptual metaphors. And if yes, in general, conceptual metaphors work implicitly. I mean, we experience something, or even in literature, in your paper was pointed out also. In literature is like a gymnasium in which we explore something that might be also very tough before we are going to cope with that in reality. It has been the role of literature for a while, before movies even. And I was just wondering if it might be that the same mechanism is in place also with the use of movies in education, so that we now explicitly can use as a source domain the movie, the target domain is our capacity, our skills that we have to learn to be leaders, to become good teachers, etc. And in this case, do people take seriously this kind of educational activity? Because I see a risk that, like serious game, people like to be involved, but then it remains like a fiction situation that is not effective then in reality. And I'm asking this really seriously because I was exactly thinking about something to propose as an educational activity in a group of organization department. But I really don't know how to propose the activity to people that is not, they are not students, they are not teacher or researcher, and so they are less available. They want always things that are really effective, pragmatic, useful. If not, they just keep playing, but not really learning.
If I could give you a fairly quick answer, Elisabetta. Yes, you're right. There's a danger that in showing a film or a TV clip, your group will consider that they can sit back, relax, put their feet up and be entertained. But I think two things are important here. One is purpose. I think you have a selling job to do. You have to sell the fact that this is going to be useful and valuable. In other words, set out the purpose for using that film in that context at that time as part of the curriculum. But the other point I made earlier in the presentation was the briefing. I think in order to ensure that your audience doesn't just regard this as entertaining, it has to be entertaining or they won't watch it. Okay, they'll lose interest. So one of the advantages of using movies is that it is entertaining and it is memorable. But I think you do need to some extent, direct attention to the specific issues, themes, topics that you want them to pay attention to. That doesn't stop, I've discovered that doesn't stop people raising other issues. They spot things that I haven't seen, that you haven't seen, but it does put them into an attentive mode. They pay attention. So I think the briefing here is the purpose of why you're doing this has to be clear, and the briefing has to be specific. And I also think if you're going to show something like The Walking Dead, which is a relatively extreme situation, I think you do need to offer a trigger warning in advance. It says, this is what you're going to see. Are you okay with that? And if they're not okay with that, then move on to do something else. Okay. Yeah. And I'm not sure I fully understood one of the points, but there's a lot of research dating, I think Erwin Janis was the first person to identify this phenomenon or concept of stress inoculation. That if people are exposed to extreme situations, on film in particular, but perhaps in novels, it's more graphic if it's in a movie, that potentially increases their resilience to real events when they actually occur. So there is research, there's a tradition of research that supports this concept of stress inoculation.
Elisabetta, before I circle back to you, can I give the word to Martin first, who's been waiting in the line?
Yep.
Thanks, everyone. I just wanted to kind of widen the frame a bit because there's some assumptions I'm a little uncomfortable with in the conversation. I guess it's something about the way in which management, business and so on is a demand for certain sorts of utility. Yeah, in other words, that we use culture in particular ways in order that we are better managers or whatever it might be, something along those lines. And that seems to me to sit at something of a tension between lots of the, well, really quite classical assumptions about what the social sciences and humanities actually do when they're deployed in university settings, which aren't necessarily about direct applications of utility, but really about some notion of a kind of humanist notion of the function of the liberal arts or something along those lines. Now, I'm not the first people to say this. As many of you will know, the latest version of the Carnegie report about a decade ago basically argued that one of the big problems with US management education was that it ignores the social science and the humanities and kind of insulates itself in this sort of horizon of utilitarianism, and consequently finds it very difficult to deal with questions of value in the most general sense. So I suppose I'm kind of interested in widening the conversation in a way, thinking about the ways in which using film and poetry and TV and comic books and any other stuff then allows us to enlarge the ways in which we think about the consequences of management and business and so on, not simply making it into more food for the business school, but rather using it in order to insist that management and organization is culture too. Yeah, that this is a way in which we demonstrate sets of ideas about our relationship to each other and the planet and the non-humans and all the rest of it. And consequently, if we want to be educating leaders who have any kind of imagination and responsibility, then insisting that they don't just read management and business should be part of our task. Now, there's not really a question there. It was more in the nature of a kind of an intervention, I suppose, because I wouldn't want this workshop for myself to be too narrowly focused on the usefulness of film for teaching management.
That's brilliant stuff, Martin. That's actually precisely how we envision the workshop to go on. So I was thinking, before perhaps asking Matteo, Arianna, or David what they think, I will give the word straight to Trevor so he can add this reflection to this.
Yeah, thank you very much. Two fascinating presentations. My question's really for David. It's partly observation, partly question. I've used film quite a lot for teaching leadership and HR, particularly with MBA and executive students. And I suppose my observation is the essence of this is really using storytelling to support knowledge and information. Whenever we were talking about observations and film, my first memory of hearing about personnel, human resource in the film context was a student in Glasgow in the early 1990s, and the classic textbook Torrington and Hall. In the preface, it had Harry Callahan of the Dirty Harry films giving his view of personnel within organisations, and it wasn't particularly positive. But so that storytelling, I think, is really important. I suppose my question, David, is from a student learning perspective, and what I found really powerful of your presentation was not just the choice of films and the rationale for it, but the briefing as well, because I think that really directs the student learning. Do you see that there is an enhancement in critical thinking and explanatory focus and evaluation from students when you've embedded film into the curriculum? And do you link that to your assessment strategies, for example?
I've never actually related it to assessment, no.
Okay.
I think that's potentially unfair on students. I mean, let's be clear. If we're talking here about a 7-minute clip or a 5-minute clip or an 8-minute clip as part of a series of lectures that might run to 20 hours plus tutorials. So this is a kind of very minor part of the lecture input. It seems to me. If I could partly answer Martin's kind of question as well, I think depending on the kind of resource that you're dealing with, I mentioned the advantages of implausibility a moment ago. If you're using material that really is implausible, that forces a discussion that goes much wider than simple utility of this style or that style or this management resource. But no, I haven't thought of using it as an assessment tool, Trevor. Sorry. And I do remember the Torrington and Hall book, and I do remember what personnel is for assholes or something.
Yeah, I think he was taking off his street duties and he was put into an office job, and it was in personnel. And that was what it was in the preface of, I think, the very early editions. Yeah, but I think it is, the storytelling aspect of it. And I think we don't really utilize, whenever in a previous institution, we had a lot of modules which looked at society and business whenever I worked in Liverpool. And some of the colleagues were brilliant in using things like I Am Daniel Blake to look at the gig economy, to look at precariousness of work, etc. And they would have embedded that into their assessment because it was incredibly powerful. The other one was they had to have a leader, and they had to either choose Margaret Thatcher, the film of Margaret Thatcher with Meryl Streep, or Abraham Lincoln, and it didn't go down well with many of the students in the groups who were from Liverpool when it was Margaret Thatcher who was the film they had to look at. But yeah, I think it is, for me, we don't use storytelling enough to enhance students' learning in any context. Not even I think this is really important for formative learning. You know, what you've been hearing so far is incredibly powerful for formative learning for students, and maybe takes them away from journal articles which they find very dense and hard to understand and read, and textbooks as well, which are maybe not at the level they need as well. So yeah, I think it's very powerful stuff.
I don't know. I want them to read the journal articles and the textbooks as well.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
My hope is that if you can draw, I think at an undergraduate level, you're dealing with a lot of students who don't give a damn. They're not actually interested. Even at master's level, I think you've got some people in the room who also have that frame of mind. I think if you can draw them in, if you can use film and TV as a way of drawing people into the discussion, into the subject matter, in a way that they're engaged with, that you stand a better chance of getting them to do a wider reading.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. That's excellent, David. Thank you.
I'm going to jump in here to give the word to Matthew, who's been patiently waiting in line. So Matthew, please open your mic.
If you'll indulge me a quick anecdote, Trevor, I do assess on students' media choices in a module that I teach about power relationships in workplaces. And last year I had a Chinese student choose to analyze the power dynamics in the 1980s series Yes Minister, and used it as a commentary on the Chinese Communist Party. Incredible. If you want to know more, chat to me another time. I was reflecting while David was answering Matteo's question on genre, and I think there is, I don't know if it's a very fruitful trajectory to explore further, and I think David answered it very, very well. But I want to indulge and meander my thoughts. I think there's something in comedy more so than other stuff, and that's probably because even when management takes itself seriously, it's quite silly and maybe probably even perversely absurd. So you can think of funny moments in very serious dramas like House of Cards or even Walking Dead and even Borgen. Those sort of laugh out loud moments. And so I don't know if there's a right or best genre, but there is probably definitely something, not necessarily in comedy as a genre, because not all comedy is funny, but the comically funny as a way to laugh at management and learn that there's something probably wrong there, that there's something in that. I don't know what it is. Which kind of brings me on to the theme that I noticed through the presentation, which by the way was absolute golden stuff. Lovely, thank you very much to our presenters, was about pedagogic utility, in a way, to borrow Martin's term, utility, of why it might be a good thing to bring films in. And there's a whole bunch of utilities, like we get to represent diverse settings, diverse peoples, diverse experiencing. We get to transport students to see things that perhaps their own frame of reference wouldn't have included because of their own biographies. But the question that I have then, so you landed on that feeling was probably something most important, like films get students to feel as they learn. And I kind of think we need to know more about what the relationship between affect and learning is, and like what kind of affects are we trying to inspire or induce when we're doing pedagogically film-driven learning. It's an open question. It's probably a question mostly for myself and why I should screen less Yes Minister, but it's less of a question and maybe more of an intervention, as Martin put it too.
To be honest, I love it. And I think it is a thread that we're all kind of traversing in this conversation today. I completely agree with Martin when he says that the risk of making everything functionalist utilitarian is always around the corner. And possibly some of the reflections that we're making in this cadre, they're also tangential to this kind of functionalism, when we think about how to brief, how to prepare the students, how to cover our bases, how to deal with sensitive stuff, how to make students uncomfortable, but not too uncomfortable, whereas instead, the idea of using film is exactly that, of widening up the idea that business studies is part and parcel of cultural studies. It's all about culture. That's something that reinstate the fundamental humanistic function of university learning. When you say maths very correctly, what kind of affect, what kind of feeling we want to transmit into students. I think that is a way to eroticize subject matters. Films do that a lot. To make them students feel the thrill of something unexpected, something that kind of throw them away from the sports and put them in a condition of like that kind of suspended note where you're playing a nice track that needs some kind of resolution. And that creates the kind of passage that Arianna was making, from confusion to active participation. And obviously, we can also frame it through cognitive load theory, and this is some material also for neurolinguistics, philosophy of language. I want to take this kind of opening trajectory and expand. Let's expand. Let's go ahead with this. I like this kind of fluid of interpretation that came out so far. I don't think I need to answer 25 specifically. It was just a free comment.
Well, thank you both. And I will probably take the opportunity to go back to Elisabetta, who had a question before. So Elisabetta, if you want to take up the mic again.
Yeah, it was the second question was about the research that Arianna is dealing with. I was just curious to know a little bit more about the questions and the answer. I was thinking that, as often happen in any kind of content, you can have as author your communicative intentions, but then the readers understand whatever they are capable to understand, and you cannot do much as author. So I was thinking if in the answer and question activity that you are working with, you experienced some difficulty in this, because you talked about useful answer, not useful answer. I was just curious to know a little bit more about this, and also your impressions behind the data. What did you get from this experiment?
Okay, the experiment was made by Matteo. I analyzed it, so I wasn't in the class. I only heard the transcription and the commentary of them. So I wasn't there, so I had to try from the sound of their voice how they were experienced that kind of question. So there was a lot of in some of them, a little bit of they were uncomfortable because he was asking about very direct question to the students, and the feeling that I have, and analyzing the reply they gave to him, it was that they thought they were asked about the film itself, about the meaning of the film itself, and about what the filmmaker was trying to do with a very... The Five Obstruction is a very experimental film. So we had this conversation in June. Probably Matthew is already bored about this, but I think it's a process. You have to use like the Devil Wears Prada at the beginning, and maybe at the end of all the module, maybe you can try to screen some experimental film. So I think that to avoid like, I like it, I don't like it, I don't like the editing of the, because a lot of replies were about the fact that there was a dancer, or that there was a not really clear editing. And obviously the point wasn't about that. So it's like you need to recognize and what is happening and how to connect to what you're studying. Sorry, I was too long.
I'm thinking about abusing my chair powers and actually asking a question myself to Martin. I don't know if you were expecting to be asked a question here, but because when I was preparing, I started looking around, and as I said to David before, I am a Walking Dead scholar. So I was thinking, in your experience writing about things like comic book villains, shipping containers, these sort of things, like have you found a shift in the narrative frame, whether through humor, metaphor, fiction? Does that help making like complex organizational ideas sound like more accessible or more engaging for a wider audience?
They certainly become more engaging for me. I mean, a lot of the writing that I've done on film and TV and culture in general is kind of just stimulated by my own fascinations, I suppose. That it gives me some cultural objects, say some early stuff I did on science fiction, for example, that I was just fascinated by science fiction, have been since I was a little kid, and so it was a really useful text to help me to think with. And then I used quite a lot of that material in teaching as well, because it seemed like quite an attractive way of getting students to think about some of the things that I wanted to get them to think about. I guess, and this is sort of a bit what I was saying before as well. I wouldn't be too, for myself, I wouldn't be too determinate in what the consequences of a particular form of engagement with some cultural text might be, because I don't know what's going to happen. Like I love going to modern art. I enjoy spending time with modern art, but I don't assume somehow that there's a right or wrong way to read it, or that it will produce the same kind of affect for me that it might do for other people, and so on. And I kind of assume that that's true of what we're discussing here. The engagement with culture in the classroom, that a whole variety of different kinds of students from different sorts of places and with different subjectivities and intersectionalities and the rest of it are going to read the kind of things that I present in some quite different ways. Just an illustration, a couple of years ago I did a book about outlaws, and there was stuff about pirates and the mafia and all that kind of stuff, and it was full of boys. It was full of boys, and I found it fascinating because it allowed me to use the mafia to talk about contemporary business, and it was really interesting. But it was continually the case that the women in the classroom remarked on the fact that it was full of boys. So that allowed us to talk about something that I was aware of, but it became a topic in the classroom in quite a seamless way, in a sense. I'm not sure I've really answered the question, Paolo. I think I've just talked about why I care about these kinds of things.
Yeah, no, it does, especially the parts when you mention the mafia. I mean, that's one of the things we do in law, for instance. If we use film, then we go straight to that stuff because it's actually quite relatable to students. And obviously, there are other things we could use in law schools and we don't, and I guess, and that's kind of bizarre because, I mean, there's much more production on law than management in film, but yet the use of film in law teaching is basically absent there. But I think Elisabetta has something to add to this, so I'm going to give the floor back to her.
No, I had a completely different question that I wanted to.
Well, go ahead, Florence, anyways.
So, but it's really interesting. Yes, and I was thinking about the stereotypes while we were speaking. Of course, you pick a movie and you are like buying also many implicit meanings, stereotypes, metaphors, imaginary that you cannot, of course, ignore. And yeah, it's always tricky, whatever. But I was curious about is a question for everyone here. Did you use or do you use the movies for the training part of lessons or also in the assessment activities?
Well, who wants to go first?
Well, I can say since I'm down the line, Thanks for the question. No, actually, I never use films for the assessment part, but I would definitely keen at exploring the possibility of doing so in the future, because I think it's an interesting way of elicit that affective perception of management, organizing, and culture in general. You know, and students, it is a kind of tool, a form of communication that they master, that they have a better command of, or and alternatively, a kind of more everyday command of. So it will probably elicit interesting interpretation of various subject matters. On just to say, Ariana and I, we're starting to refine what kind of film we should show in the next module of managing human resources. And one of the potential films we wanted to show is using clips this time, so not 40 minutes, using clips from the documentary American Factory 2019, which is a film where basically an American factory, a glass factory, gets acquired, gets bought by a Chinese company, and there is a lot of conflict and tension that emerge from the erasure of trade union and managing human resources, management human resources practices in general. So I think it would be interesting to use it with a briefing on topics addressed throughout the carousel of the module, like emotional labor, learning and training, conflict in the workplace, employment relations, and leadership. And about conflict, just want to say, I think it's for Martin and Matt prevalently, but actually open to everyone. You know, when we talk about conflict in the workplace, I know, Martin, that you dealt a lot in your research with the countercultural representations of management in films and popular culture, and how, you know, this kind of tension and conflict can really elicit and generate reflections on who we are, what we do in our everyday life, in our workplace, and whether Matt has used any of these in the Power at Work module, because we never really had a chance to talk about it, and this is a perfect platform for doing that.
Martin, do you want to take it, or shall I go to Matthew first?
No, sure. I mean, one of the things I was continually, I suppose I still am continually concerned with, is to try to be where students are, to start with them, which is not, you know, no more than Socrates was trying to do in the forum. You know, sorry, in the in his dialogues. But that meant that quite often I would use things like, say, a Simpsons cartoon or something like that as a way of gaining some kind of rapport or shared understanding or something like that. So they might expect that I would be, you know, some dull management professor standing at the front talking shit, and instead I'd show them some, you know, some bit of Mr. Burns being mad about his nuclear power plant. And that really seemed to kind of help. It helped the energy in the room, and it gave us something really interesting to talk about. And very often students would then riff on other examples of sort of you know, crazy bosses in TV and film and all the rest of it. And I again, you know, I was doing it to produce a particular kind of set of assumptions and affects, I suppose. There wasn't an intention to teach them about X or anything like that, but to kind of get them thinking, to open them up, to break the classroom a bit, you know. I think that's my response. It's all a bit inarticulate, but I need to think about this stuff a bit more.
I think it's actually going great. And whilst I was speaking, I gave everybody a glimpse of what's happening in the whiteboard or blackboard. Is what our artist Marco is doing there. It's coming out a very nice map. Matthew, I'm going to give the mic to you now.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a standalone question, but it does kind of respond to Elisabetta's question to all of us. I tried to show at least a couple of short clips from fairly mainstream film and television in every lecture that I do for a couple of reasons, partly to do with my own kind of regulating cognitive and emotional energy. But I also think it's pretty shitty and diabolical to subject anyone to an hour and 20 minutes of me talking. So it's kind of useful. I know I couldn't list the range of stuff, and I would just be playing a game of cultural capital Guess Who if I mentioned the shows that I draw from. But, you know, Peaky Blinders is an absolute favourite of my students at the moment. How I Get Away with Murder, How to Get Away with Murder, students love. Some of that actually reflects the demographic of how we recruit. at Leicester as well, cultural research touches on that. Now, the question or point that I wanted to, it links in. Okay, so there's a tension though between, so Martin presents like a radical openness to follow curiosity into the unknown to a certain extent of critique and exploration. And Matteo framed that, I think, quite nicely with the best word I've heard today as an eroticization, following an Audre Lorde and others that have properly taken the sense of erotics. And I am really interested in how we bring the erotic into our teaching practice, more so, not in the narrow sense of the term it gets used in mainstream online hubs that now in the UK you have to age verify for. Anyway, but then there is, Arianna, I welcome and thank you for like the pragmatism that you bring to the discussion, which is, you know, the advice to show something familiar to start with and build it up. Don't abuse students with 2 hours of a show or even 40 minutes of a show, chunk it or so on. And so the tension for me is like, as educators, we kind of do need to have, to some extent, some instrumentalism of kind of broadly what we're trying to direct our students towards knowing and learning. And then this tension, okay, is really well reflected for me in one of my students' assessments that they returned to me. So the student chose The Lion King to analyse for their power analysis. And so what I don't do is their final year undergraduate business and management students, and I don't want them to give me film and TV or even culture studies assignments back. I assume that they don't know how to analyse mise en scène or what a screen text is or anything like this. They don't need to. So the first bit of writing I get them to do is from the first person perspective of a character. So write as if you were a character, slip in some of the module's technical terms. So if they're studying Rosa Beth Moss Cantor, then they'll talk about the shadow culture of the organisation or whatever. And so this student submitted to me that the murder of Scar, which of course I always then go away and watch the scenes, and I cried. Sorry, the murder of Mufasa, Simba's dad, was akin to a political assassination of the order of JFK. I thought super astute, but that actually Scar was a liberatory and was attempting to emancipate the hyenas of the story. And I thought, what a wonderful spin on an otherwise what could have been a very dull sort of generic reading of a romantic Disney film. And so that there lies my tension. Had I have tried to apply too much directive learning, that student might not have recognised the political subjectivities of resistance and struggle, of the hyenas. So it's not a question, or maybe it's an invite for those of you that are better crafted at maybe doing the debrief and discussion, the dialogic part of this, not just the screening. Some advice on how you facilitate and what the balance, how you balance that between not being too directive, but also having at least something that they've got to learn and take away.
Yeah, I think Matteo can answer this from a technical perspective, whilst I remind everybody, especially the Leicester people, that I don't want to see you in front of my disciplinary commission for showing something erotic to students. But jokes aside, with my lawyer hat on, it's always like, and this is not just about eroticism. I'm thinking about David showing The Walking Dead. I mean, where do we draw? I mean, personally, we'll show everything to students, obviously, but because of my lawyer role, I always think, okay, can I show Rick Grimes shooting an unarmed or allegedly unarmed guy into a bar in front of my students? Some of them might come from trauma. Some of them might come from countries where, you know, shooting somebody in a bar is not entirely unprecedented. So can I do that without actually, well, I want to say without hurting their fragile psyches, but, you know, the question is always a joke until we end up in the disciplinary commission. And I've been part of those committees more than once for things that actually sounded innocuous until they were actually taken to class. And obviously in law, we have certain keywords that we cannot use, even though we're talking about certain crimes. Again, I'm not going to use those words, but you can imagine what I'm talking about. So I can just imagine all the problems that might happen from a legal perspective with film. But from a more technical perspective, Matteo, do you want to take over this?
No, that's absolutely fantastic. And I wanted to ask you, Paolo, actually, um, because, cinematically, I am personally really shocked and pierced by certain genre in particular, and the juridical genre is one of the genres that really pierces the screen. Together with boxing, together with pool playing, poker playing, and I was really wondering. How would you how would you personally um, embody this kind of films in your own teaching or in international law or in philosophy of law? That would be interesting.
For
Have you
me,
ever?
you mean?
Yeah, you. And
Oh,
then
I
what?
don't. I don't. I mean, as those who know me, including you, who are my neighbor, know this quite well. I am very much terrible in terms of, well, film, visual culture, all these things. But I can answer from a different perspective. I mean, there are films like My Cousin Vinny with Immortal Joe Pesci, who are actually used by the American Bar Association to train lawyers, and not because of the legal part of the film, which is actually quite accurate, especially if compared with things like Suits or I don't know, The Good Wife, for instance, but also because of the antics. I mean, the antics that he uses in court, like giving the meter to one of the witnesses and then pulling out, or comparing car tires to dog shit, and all these sort of things actually work because they show the students, or well, the future lawyers in that case, how to basically deal with an hostile judge, with an hostile jury, with all these sort of situations. I mean, that's actually much more realistic, even though it's full of jokes, than, for instance, A Few Good Men, with Tom Cruise really attacking Jack Nicholson, Jack Nicholson accepting to answer a question, even though the judge said you don't have to answer this. That will never happen in real life. Whilst anything that happens in My Cousin Vinny is absolutely plausible, except for Joe Pesci showing up in court with a butler uniform. That's probably not happening. But as I said before, I'm actually quite interested in sharing this session because, from my perspective, I'm learning a lot because the legal world and law schools are far behind management studies, even though, as I said before, we will have much broader, much more material to draw from. Whilst in management, I mean, as I hear today, like from you, from Arianna, from David especially, I will never think about looking at Walking Dead. And I said before, I studied The Walking Dead from a legal perspective. I never actually thought about using The Walking Dead from a management perspective or from even for a pedagogical perspective. So this is actually quite interesting to me on top of educative. So I was wondering whether David has some extra thoughts on this.
Very good. Just an interesting point, which I think both Martin and Matthew made just before we lose it. This has been a very student-centric, teaching-centric, teaching-focused conversation. But the point that I think both Martin and Matthew made was that as a lecturer, I want to enjoy this lecture too. I want to enjoy this tutorial. I want to be entertained. So I will choose something that I can laugh at or something I can enjoy, something I like discussing, something that's provoked me, and show that to them at the same time. I think the instructor's perception here is key, because I think, as Matthew also said, if you, the instructor, are energized, that will transmit itself to the student body as well.
Martin.
I was just going to respond directly to Matteo's question about alternative organisation and so on, because it seems to me that there's a bit of a problem there in that the representations of management work business in conventional film are pretty negative. In general, work's a drudge, managers are lunatics or vampires, etc., and it's very difficult to find anything other than slightly dull documentaries which present alternative forms, co-ops and worker ownership and all that kind of stuff. Because that's what I'd really like to be able to do, is to be presenting materials which show that other forms of work organization are possible, something along those lines. But instead, we seem to be largely focused on critique in that sense, because I think that's what the history of film over the last, well, particularly since the 1970s, has really done. It's presented corporations and managers as being has been culturally very problematic in a whole variety of ways. That was that was my introduction to science fiction in a sense, is that, the most common baddie in science fiction films was the corporation. That's usually the organizational form that lies behind the production of the robot or the alien or anything else, some bad corporation. So it'd be nice to have more positive presentations of alternatives, Mattia, but I don't think we have them.
I agree with what you're saying. Sorry to interject, Paolo. I didn't just meant essentially classical or positive representations of management, but just the idea, having extreme diegesis, extreme fictionalized elements that can show us, look, there is nothing like a single autocratic leader. There is never a single follower, but we can all be leaders and followers, or just even eventually collapse this kind of hierarchy that we have in our organizations. And this is very much displayed in science fiction, in the apocalyptic scenarios, without calling Dario Zellini documentaries on recuperated companies in France or Italy, or Frederick Wiseman 2-3 hours, even longer documentaries in schools, hospitals. That would be absolutely a fatality for the attention of students. But using these kind of fictional elements, films like Contact, 12 Angry Men.
If I can interject here from my non-management perspective, but I'm thinking again, the world of cinema, the world of movies, the world of comics is fascinating with villains, mostly because the good guy is never that interesting. I mean, you want to make a film about some lawyer who defends people who accidentally run over somebody else with a car. You are fascinated with the guys who take some guilty ones and let them get away with it, or the prosecutor who, I don't know, convicts an incredibly evil person. But again, with law, we had the problem that a lot of students come to law school thinking they're going to be these flamboyant lawyers, and they realize most of the work is going to be busy stuff in the office, and most of the clients are absolutely dull and boring. But that's the problem with cinema. Again, whilst looking at you guys and starting to prepare for this, I looked at some of the films that Matteo suggested to me, and it was very rarely some virtuous company who makes sustainable products. It's always somebody evil there, otherwise there's no fun, I guess. Meanwhile, I'll just give you another glimpse of what Marco is brilliantly doing with your words, and this map is going to look amazing. Oh yeah, David.
Just not to put a damper on proceedings, but just a final, more of a question than a comment, because this is something that I've been asked, and I don't have a perfect answer to it. But if you show a movie or a documentary or a TV series or even a clip just of a few minutes, what copyright issues does that raise? Paolo, I should really address that question to you with the legal background.
No, that's the beauty of it. As long as you do that for educational purposes, you can actually do whatever you want. You can show an entire film to class, and there's no danger of anything. I mean, if a corporation calls you and says, well, you shown our film in class, now you got to pay royalties or things like that, you can simply tell them to piss off, because, for educational purposes, there's a big exception. And thanks, Matteo is calling fair dealing. And in fairness, when I used to teach intellectual property law, which is incredibly technical and boring, that's where I stopped. One of the things I was showing people was how to use sampling to make new things. And some of the things were obvious, like using Bittersweet Symphony of the Verve, that basically samples 3 seconds of the Rolling Stones and plays it over for like 5 minutes. And the Rolling Stones actually won that case because that was clear plagiarism. But then there is an interesting thing between Michael Jackson and Albano. And if you non-Italians don't know Albano, there's a good reason for that. Zucchero Fornaciari has been involved in a number of cases like this. But the beauty of teaching was that I could literally play an entire playlist in class with no danger of being called back and say, hey, you need to pay us royalties. So go nuts in the classroom, show everything. You can show the entire film and just comment on it, and no one can say anything to that. I tried to explain that to pretty much everyone in Leicester, and because we had a case a few years ago with somebody actually stole a copy of a film, yeah, that's illegal. But as long as it's in the library, you have a license, you can show whatever you want in glass. They can't ask you for a dime. Right. Any final thought, or shall I pass the ball to the organizers for some final remarks? Okay, Arianna, you've been quiet for a while, so I'm just going to give it to you.
Well, I'm going to close, so it's 2 hours. So I think I have to thank you all and you for so much food for thought, and I'm leaving with plenty of ideas to reflect and build upon. And I'm pretty sure that I'm talking for Matteo too. So and I want to thank you because you truly embracing the spirit of this workshop and makes it productive and really useful. So thank you. For me, this is just the beginning. So, and I hope to bring films as you all said that you did in your work, and I hope that my future will work with students using in a way that's I will use films in a way that spark dialogue and deepen engagement, as you said, and definitely Matteo and I will carry all this insight forward as we continue to shape this project, probably with a conference. And obviously, as we said at the beginning, we explore the possibility of a publication. So I don't know if Matteo wants to add.
Nothing to say to what you already brilliantly said, Arianna. I just want to thank everybody for having participated in this conversation. Some of my friends that it was a long time I didn't see, and it's been absolutely fantastic. And I hope that this conversation will go ahead with a conference or a publication or whichever the better. Thanks, Paolo, for sharing and directing this workshop so well as well. Thanks a lot. And of course to Marco.
Marco, yeah.
Yeah,
And
Bridget. And Bridget, yeah. So
Yeah.
Just before we close, I want to thank again David and Matt and Martin, Elisabetta, Bridget, Marco, Trevor, and Millicent, Manassa, Berth, and Vel and Pritha for staying with us until the very end. It's been 2 very fun hours. And as I said, as a neutral observer, I'm just excited to see what this project will bring forward. So thanks, everybody. Have a great rest of the day. And I guess you'll hear from Arianna Matteo very soon. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.